In the mid-1870s, Mason County, Texas was a place where rising cattle prices, lingering Civil War divisions, and weak law enforcement collided. Accusations of cattle theft spread faster than proof, vigilante justice replaced the courts, and fear turned neighbors into enemies. What followed was the Mason County War, also known as the Hoodoo War, a violent descent into lynchings, ambushes, and daylight killings that left more than a dozen men dead in barely a year. With many official records lost to a courthouse fire and surviving accounts often conflicting, this episode reconstructs how a frontier community unraveled and how vengeance came to rule where the law failed. Well, let's get into it, shall we? My name's Steven, and welcome to Wild West Deep Dives. Before we begin, I want to expand on what I mentioned in the intro. It's important to understand that the Mason County War is one of those frontier stories where certainty is hard to come by. In January of 1877, the Mason County Courthouse burned, destroying court records, indictments, and testimony tied directly to the feud, leaving historians to rely on newspapers, ranger recollections, and later memoirs, many of them conflicting or shaped by personal bias. Even basic details, including names and spellings, vary from source to source, and much of what survives exists in the gray space between fact and hearsay. There was also a saying that came from a survivor of the war: "The trouble is over, let it die." Though, I worked hard to create the most careful reconstruction possible, built by comparing accounts and tracing where they overlap. Not to create heroes or villains, but to tell the story of how fear, vigilante justice, and vengeance tore Mason County apart. Mason County's roots reach back to the frontier edge of Texas settlement in the mid-1840s, when a handful of pioneers filtered into the hill country along Comanche Creek. Long before the town of Mason existed, the area was a well-known indigenous campsite centered around Gamble Spring, a reliable water source in an otherwise harsh landscape. Before any white man saw the country, this was the land of the Apache, Comanche, and the Kiowa, among others. Early arrivals like William S. Gamble settled amid uncertainty, relying on tenuous treaties and uneasy coexistence with Comanche bands. The establishment of Fort Mason in 1851 gave the region a military anchor, offering protection, employment, and a sense of permanence that drew settlers, many of them German immigrants moving west into the surrounding countryside. As the fort grew, a civilian community took shape nearby. Mason developed not as a planned town, but as a practical outgrowth of frontier necessity, with settler stores, blacksmith shops, and supply depots serving both soldiers and settlers. Mail routes connected Mason to San Antonio and points farther west, and mule wagons hauled supplies across rough terrain. Despite this fragile infrastructure, life remained dangerous. Indian raids persisted through the 1850s and intensified during the Civil War years, when federal troops withdrew and local militias struggled to fill the gap. Families clustered around the fort for safety, reinforcing a culture of mutual defense, suspicion of outsiders, and reliance on armed self-protection. The Civil War left Mason County isolated and vulnerable. Fort Mason was surrendered to Confederate authorities in 1861, but remained largely unmanned, offering little protection during some of the most dangerous years for local settlers. When the fort was permanently abandoned in the late 1860s, its buildings and materials were scavenged by residents, symbolically folding the military presence into civilian life. By this time, Mason had secured its place as county seat and began developing basic institutions of government and law. Economically, the years after the Civil War transformed Mason County from a marginal frontier into a valuable cattle region tied directly to national markets. What had once been a subsistence economy suddenly revolved around livestock. In the immediate post-war years, cattle were so cheap they were often killed only for their hides. But by the early 1870s, demand exploded as thousands of Texas Longhorns were driven north to Kansas railheads. Ranching became the backbone of the local economy, and with it came disputes over land ownership, grazing rights, and most critically, the cattle themselves. Livestock now represented real wealth, yet law enforcement remained thin, informal, and often politically contested. In a land where nearly every man went armed and frontier justice was still widely accepted, accusations could carry deadly weight. These pressures fell unevenly across Mason County's population. German immigrants, who had settled much of Mason and neighboring Gillespie County in the early years, tended to be small stock raisers and farmers who owned some of the best land in the region. They spoke a different language, worshipped in different churches, and maintained customs that set them apart from their Anglo neighbors, marking the German settlers as distinct in both daily life and identity. For years, the difference had been tempered by necessity. Survival on the frontier demanded cooperation, especially in a region still threatened by Indian raids well into the 1860s. But the Civil War shattered that fragile balance. When Texas voted overwhelmingly to secede, Mason County stood apart, casting its vote almost unanimously to remain in the Union. German communities such as Loyal Valley became openly associated with Union loyalty, not out of convenience but conviction, grounded in political beliefs carried with them from Europe. In a Confederate state, that stance carried lasting consequences. Union loyalty branded the German settlers as outsiders long after the war ended, and in some parts of Texas, it led to outright violence. Mason County avoided open bloodshed during the war itself, but suspicion and resentment took root all the same. Confederate sympathizers viewed the Germans as politically unreliable, culturally alien, and, when economic pressures mounted, convenient scapegoats. Reconstructions deepened those divisions. When federal troops occupied Fort Mason after the war, order was largely maintained, but the Army's withdrawal in 1869 left peacekeeping to local officials. To some Anglo-Texans, those officials represented lingering Union influence, even though Mason County's population remained tiny and isolated. At the same time, cattle theft, real and perceived, became a growing source of anger. Open range practices blurred the line between honest roundup work and outright rustling, and some cowboys were not overly concerned with whose brand they carried to market. German stockmen, who kept smaller, tamer herds, were particularly vulnerable. By the summer of 1874, cattle theft had become such a concern that Wilson Hay, the county's presiding justice, wrote directly to Governor Richard Koch requesting troops to help restore order. Rumors of rustling spread quickly in a small, heavily armed community already divided by language, politics, and wartime loyalties. German settlers increasingly believed they were being targeted, while Anglo cattlemen insisted these were operating openly and without consequence. Neither side trusted local law enforcement to protect them, and both believed justice was slipping out of reach. That fragile balance collapsed under Sheriff John Clark, elected in 1873 by Mason County's German majority. Clark was an enigmatic figure whose past remains largely unknown. What was clear, however, was his approach to law enforcement. Clark showed little patience for courts or procedure when it came to cattle theft. He surrounded himself with armed deputies and supporters and made no secret of his belief that suspected rustlers deserved swift punishment. In August 1874, Clark and a large posse arrested several respected cattlemen from neighboring counties who claimed they were lawfully rounding up their own stock. Though they were released on bond, their herds were scattered and their livelihoods damaged, and charges of false imprisonment and robbery were soon filed against the sheriff. The lines were being drawn. The situation exploded in February of 1875. Clark and his posse arrested 9 men, including Elijah and Pete Backus, that headed the notorious Backus gang of cattle rustlers, in neighboring McCulloch County on suspicion of cattle theft and brought them to the Mason jail. 4 managed to post bond and leave, or they could have just escaped, but the remaining 5 stayed behind to await trial. At the same time, Clark openly spoke in favor of lynching cattle thieves, further inflaming tensions. Just days later, a 17-year-old cowboy named Alan Bolt was found dead beside a road near Mason by a man named Adam Brayford. A note was pinned to his body, declaring him a, quote, noted cow thief. It was the first vigilante killing in the county, and it sent a clear message that accusations alone could now be fatal. On the night of the 18th of February, 1875, Mason County crossed from tension to terror. A band of armed men with blackened or masked faces forced their way into the home of Deputy Sheriff John Worley, frightening his family and compelling him to surrender the jail keys, apparently by almost choking him to death. The mob went straight to the jail, dragged out the 5 prisoners accused of cattle theft, and marched them south along the Fredericksburg Road. Near Hicks Springs, they stopped and carried out their own version of justice. Cousins Elijah and Pete Backus were hanged. Abe Wiggins was shot in the head and left mortally wounded. Tom Turley was strung up, but survived, and Charlie Johnson managed to knock the noose from his neck and escape into the night. The vigilantes melted away after Texas Ranger Captain Dan Roberts, who happened to be in Mason that evening, and Sheriff John Clark both arrived on the scene. What followed remains murky. Some accounts claim they arrived too late to intervene at all. The damage had been done, and they helped revive Tom Turley, while others suggest they made no effort to stop the killings and arrived only after the damage had been done. By morning, the Backus brothers were dead. Wiggins would die the next day, and Alan Bolt was already buried. That made 4 killings in a matter of weeks. An investigation followed, but it led nowhere. Worley and his wife said they could not identify the masked men, and neither Clark nor Roberts produced any suspects. No arrests were made, and the silence that followed spoke louder than any verdict. Rather than restoring order, the lynchings shattered what little trust remained. Rumors spread almost immediately that another raid on the jail was planned, this time to finish off Tom Turley and to deal with anyone else suspected of rustling. When former posse member Caleb Hall was jailed on similar accusations, both he and Turley decided not to wait for the noose. They dug their way out of the jail and fled the county. Another former posse member, Tom Gamble, openly condemned the hangings and soon feared he would be next. But instead of running, Gamble gathered roughly 30 armed men from surrounding ranches and rode into Mason to confront Sheriff Clark directly. For a brief moment, the balance of power shifted, and Clark fled town. That standoff nearly erupted into open warfare, but Clark returned weeks later with an estimated 60 armed supporters, many of them German settlers. Both sides drifted toward the courthouse square, fingers near triggers, until cooler heads prevailed and negotiations produced a fragile truce. It would hold only as long as vigilante killing stopped. For nearly 2 months, the agreement kept bloodshed at bay, but the underlying tensions never eased. This uneasy peace collapsed in May, when Sheriff Clark sent Deputy John Worley to Carl Lindbergh's ranch to bring in Tim Williamson, a respected and widely liked cattleman who also owned a small spread of his own. Williamson had previously been arrested on a minor cattle theft charge, but at the time was free on bond, a common practice on the frontier when an accused man was not considered a risk of leaving the county. Lindbergh agreed to post a new bond later that day, but Worley insisted Williamson accompany him to Mason. Before they left, Worley disarmed Williamson and compelled him to trade his older horse for Williamson's younger, faster mount. The 3 men then rode toward town, unaware they were being watched. Roughly 10 miles outside Mason, a group of about a dozen masked men rode out and cut them off. When the ambush unfolded, Lindbergh and Worley galloped off, but Williamson's horse was shot out from under him, leaving him unarmed and on foot. Some accounts later claimed that the shot came from one of the masked men. Others alleged Worley himself had shot the horse. What is certain is that Williamson recognized at least one of his attackers and attempted to reason with him, but no mercy was given. He was shot down where he stood, without trial or a chance to defend himself. From that moment forward, the violence in Mason County ceased to be a campaign against alleged rustlers and became an open, vengeful feud, driven as much by ethnic hatred and personal grievance as by cattle theft, signaling the true beginning of the Mason County War. Scott Koulie entered the Mason County War not as a drifter or a gun for hire, but as a man driven by personal loyalty and rage. Tim Williamson had been more than a trail partner to him. He had been a mentor, an employer, and by many counts, a father figure. Koulie had ridden with Williamson on cattle drives to Kansas, worked for him, and had even been nursed back to health by Williamson's wife during a bout of typhoid fever. When word reached Koulie, then trying to establish himself as a rancher near Menard, that Williamson had been murdered without trial, his reaction was immediate and uncompromising. He swore revenge, convinced that Sheriff John Clark, Deputy John Worley, and a German-led mob were responsible, and he believed that the law had failed so completely that justice could only be taken by force. Koulie was no stranger to violence. Born in Missouri in the mid-1850s and raised on the Texas frontier, he grew up in a world shaped by Indian raids and retaliation. His father, Matthias Koulie, was shot and killed in 1870. Before he was 20, he had already participated in bloody encounters on the frontier and developed a reputation for fearlessness and cruelty. In 1874, he enlisted in the newly formed Frontier Battalion of the Texas Rangers, serving under Major John B. Jones. During his short tenure, Koulie took part in brutal Indian fights that hardened him further, earning a reputation as a man willing to do whatever was necessary. Budget cuts forced his discharge late that year, but the ranger experience gave him training, confidence, and a deep familiarity with the men who would later be sent to hunt him. After Williamson's death in May of 1875, and the grand jury's refusal to indict anyone for the killing, Koulie concluded that the courts were complicit. He quietly began gathering information, moving through Mason without attracting attention, and compiling a list of those he believed had taken part in the ambush. He also gathered allies, men like John and Moses Beard, George Gladden, and John Ringgold, better known as John Ringo, many of whom had known Williamson's personally or resented Sheriff Clark's methods. This was not random violence. Koulie believed he was conducting a targeted campaign of retribution. On the 10th of August 1875, Koulie struck openly for the first time. Riding into Mason, he asked about the whereabouts of Deputy Sheriff John Worley, and he learned he was working at a well on the west edge of town. Koulie rode out, spoke briefly with Worley, and waited until the man turned his back to haul another worker up from the well. Koulie then shot Worley through the back of the head. As the windlass spun free, the man being raised fell back into the well, and another fled the scene. Koulie fired repeatedly into Worley's body, scalped him, and rode away. This killing sent shockwaves through Mason County. The war was no longer whispered about, it was unmistakably underway. 9 days later, Koulie rode into the Barter farm in Llano County, apparently seeking Peter Barter, one of the men accused of participating in Williamson's murder. Instead, he encountered Peter's brother, Carl Bader, working in a field. Koulie rode him down and shot him, killing him on the spot. With Worley and Bader dead, the tally of victims rose, and fear spread rapidly through the German settlements. Sheriff Clark secured a reward for Koulie's arrest, but capturing him proved far more difficult than expected. Violence now accelerated on both sides, spilling far beyond the original accusations of cattle theft. Gunfights erupted in broad daylight, ambushes took place on open roads, and men were hunted at their homes or while riding alone across the range. One of the most violent encounters occurred at Keller's store along the Llano River, where Sheriff Clark and his supporters clashed with men aligned against him. In the exchange of gunfire, Moses Beard and George Gladden were both wounded. Beard would die later of his injuries, adding yet another name to the growing list of the dead, while Gladden narrowly survived. Elsewhere, the rule of law collapsed entirely. Men were arrested and marched off under guard, only to vanish without explanation. Among them was William Koch, seized at John Gamble's ranch and sent toward Mason in custody. He was never seen again, and no credible account of his fate ever emerged. Each killing intensified the atmosphere of fear and suspicion. Families armed themselves, neighbors chose sides, and silence became a form of self-preservation. No one knew who might be targeted next or whether a knock at the door meant a lawful arrest or an execution. Accusations traveled faster than facts, and vengeance replaced restraint. With every disappearance and every gunshot, the feud widened, pulling in men who had no direct connection to the original crimes but now felt compelled to act in defense of friends, kin, or reputation. By early September, the conflict had spiraled beyond Mason County's ability to contain it. Moses Beard's brother, John, rode into Mason County determined to avenge him, joined by armed men from Burnett, Llano, Blanco, and Baxter counties. Among them was John Ringo, who now threw in his lot with Scott Koulie's faction. What had begun as a local feud over cattle and vigilante justice was rapidly becoming a regional vendetta, with heavily armed riders converging on Mason County and the prospect of full-scale warfare looming closer by the day. The killings drew the attention of the state, and Governor Richard Koch ordered Major John B. Jones and detachments of the Texas Rangers to restore order. Jones arrived to find a county paralyzed by fear and deeply divided in its loyalties. Worse still, he soon realized that many of his own Rangers, especially those who had once served with Koulie, were sympathetic to the Avenger. Rumors spread that some had quietly warned Koulie of patrol movements and simply refused to pursue him in earnest. Faced with open insubordination, Jones took drastic action, offering honorable discharges to any ranger unwilling to hunt Koulie. About 15 men stepped forward. Even with rangers in the field, the violence continued. Ambushes near Mason left more men dead and wounded, including cattle inspector Daniel Horster. Sheriff Clark, increasingly isolated and fearing for his life, eventually resigned and fled the county. By late 1876, exhaustion, not justice, finally brought the Mason County War to an end. After nearly a year of killings, ambushes, and lynchings, the departure or removal of the feud's principal figures allowed a strained calm to return to the hill country. Even then, peace came slowly. Mason County did not truly settle back into recognizable law and order until well into 1877. On the night of the 21st of January of that year, the county courthouse burned to the ground, destroying every official record connected to the feud. Arson was widely suspected, and the timing all but guaranteed that many of the war crimes would never be fully examined or prosecuted. Remarkably, no man in Mason County was ever convicted for any of the killings committed during the Hoodoo War. Arrests were made, and some trials were held elsewhere, but justice proved elusive. George Gladden, after recovering from his wounds, was later accused of killing Peter Barter in Lano County, though sources disagree over whether Scott Koulie had already done so. Other suspected participants were killed themselves, disappeared, or slipped quietly out of the region. As for Koulie, once his supporters within the Rangers were discharged and the pressure intensified, he was arrested, but after a successful breakout in the spring of 1876, he drifted through Fredericksburg before returning to Blanco County. Within weeks, he fell violently ill and died on the 10th of June, 1876, at just 21 years old. Officially, the cause was listed as brain fever, though rumors of poisoning circulated for years. He died without ever standing trial for the men he had killed, and his grave in Miller Creek Cemetery marked the quiet end of the most feared avenger of the Hoodoo War. John Ringo and George Gladden were arrested later in 1876, with Gladden receiving a lengthy prison sentence in which he was later pardoned, and Ringo faced an indictment for murder. When the Mason County Courthouse burned, Ringo's case collapsed along with it. After his eventual release, he lingered briefly in the county, long enough to be elected constable, before riding west. There, in Arizona Territory, he would become entangled in another, far more famous feud, his name forever tied to the frontier town of Tombstone. When the principal combatants were gone, dead, jailed, or driven out, the killings stopped, yet the bitterness lingered for decades. Neighbors remembered who had ridden with who had stayed silent, and who had benefited from the chaos. Though 10 to 12 men were killed during the Mason County War, only one was ever convicted of murder, and very few of the dead were ever proven cattle thieves. The Mason County War stands as one of the most disturbing feuds in Texas history, not because of its scale, but because of how completely law, rumor, and vengeance replaced justice in a small community that had once depended on cooperation to survive. I hope y'all enjoyed this episode on the Mason County War. If you did, please give a thumbs up and maybe subscribe. And if you're listening on Spotify, please give a 5-star rating. All of this really helps the podcast grow and reach more listeners, and I appreciate y'all's support. Join the membership family. For just $1, you'll get access to bonus content like the brand new episode I just posted on James H. Levy, the Forgotten Gunfighter. I appreciate everyone's support, and to the membership family, thank you. Y'all are absolutely amazing. My hope for the membership family is for it to be member-driven. Y'all give me a topic, and I cover it. We will see y'all next time, and remember, when in doubt, shoot straight, shoot fast. God bless.